This is World History Chapter 1, Renaissance and Reformation, discussion number 4, the Reformation. The Renaissance was an important time during European history, but it wasn't just for the artists and the independent thinking that was coming around. Independent thinking was also coming on the religious side of European history. It's called the Reformation. Now, the Reformation is essentially the European break from one church and the idea that you can make your own decision about what you believe. The Protestant Reformation came from people being frustrated with the behaviors of the Catholic Church on a geopolitical level. The popes were meddling in European politics. The basic idea is that the pope would go around saying, if you don't obey your prince or king or duke, then you're disobeying God and then you're going to go to hell. So the whole idea of enforcing who you have to listen to really started putting people in the wrong ideas. Also, the church was getting into collecting a whole bunch of money for seemingly unnecessary purposes. The selling of indulgences to support lavish living by the hierarchy. See, indulgences were the opportunity for someone to pay money in order to get themselves out of eternal punishment for sins that they did not confess to the church. So once a person died, they'd go to be punished for the sins they had not confessed, and then you could pay the persons the way out of that punishment by giving gifts to the church in a way of asking for forgiveness for someone else. So this kind of thing is what people were getting frustrated with and seeing that this doesn't quite add up. Now, of course, remember that most people didn't have a choice. They were stuck with what their priest was telling them in their Catholic Church. However, some people who were able to read the Bible for themselves because they had been educated and had read the Bible for themselves in the Latin started to see that this was not exactly what was supposed to be happening. Now, some of the early Reformation leaders were John Wycliffe and John Huss. Now, John Wycliffe, hopefully it has a little bit of a ring to you because Wycliffe translators. Wycliffe wanted to translate the Bible into English so that people could read it for themselves in England. John Huss wanted to translate the Bible into a Germanic language. Now, John Huss ticked off a lot of people. You see here on the map on slide number 22 where Bohemia is. It's a part of what we would now call Germany and goes into it borders on Hungary. John Huss was actually burned at the stake because he was advocating for people to read the Bible for themselves instead of depending on the Catholic Church to be the mode of their salvation. Now, the biggest reformer of the Reformation, I think you all would recognize to be Martin Luther. Now, he was a Catholic monk who taught at a local university. And he questioned the idea of indulgences. What he did was he wrote a nice long paper saying these are 95 reasons why the indulgences really are not applicable to the Christian faith. And he posted these on the Wittenberg Castle door. It's kind of like the town bulletin board. He essentially was calling out the Catholic Church saying, this is not right. He advocated for the idea of justification by faith alone, not by indulgences, not by paying off the Catholic Church to get your guy or your loved one out of purgatory. It was faith. He encouraged people to individually learn for themselves the Bible instead of depending on the clergy. He translated the Bible into the Germanic language, which really ticked off the Catholic Church because, again, they weren't listening to him, to the church. They were listening to what they read in the Bible. Now, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who, being Catholic, invited Luther to come to what was called the Diet of Worms, a big meeting in the town called Worms. Not sure I want to live there, but that's what the town was called. Now, it was originally posted that this was going to be a debate, and Luther was going to have the opportunity to defend his new teaching of justification by faith alone. When Luther was called in front of Charles V, there was a stack of books that Luther had written and pamphlets, and Charles V said, "Do you stand by what is written here?" Now, Luther all of a sudden realized that he wasn't going to be able to give a sermon justifying justification by faith alone. So he asked for the day in the evening to consider his response. Next morning, gets called in front of the Holy Roman Emperor, and Holy Roman Emperor poses him the exact same question, and Luther essentially says, nope, I cannot recant anything that's in here. I believe it's to be truth. At that point, Charles V was declared an outlaw, which means that no law would protect him. If you wanted to kill him, beat him up, cheat him out of his money, anything you wanted to do, Luther was going to be beyond the protection of the law. Now, he did allow Martin Luther to escape to a prince that kind of liked Luther. Luther hid in that castle for several years. And that's where he actually did a lot of his translation and a lot of his writing advocating that people ought to do for themselves. Now, Luther's doctrine said all Christians had equal access to God. They didn't have to go through a priest in order to pray. That was a big thing that the Roman Catholic Church required. Ordinary people ought to be able to read the Bible, thus drawing into the vernacular, words that people could read for themselves. He didn't think that indulgences were required. He didn't think that having to go confess to a priest should be required. He also said that the idea that sometimes the priest would say, in order to get your forgiveness or to get yourself in good with God, you have to go to a specific place that had some type of saint connected to it. And so they had to, they said, you don't have to do that. You don't have to earn your salvation, justification by faith alone. Another thing that Luther advocated was that clergy should be able to marry. This whole idea of being married to the Roman Catholic Church and that all the priests had to remain single just didn't seem right to him. You know, Adam and Eve were wife. Why can't they be wife? Of course, Luther might have had a secondary idea because he ended up marrying a former nun. But Luther's teaching was very popular with the peasants because remember that the Pope was going around saying you have to obey this leader. And the leader could do anything they wanted to the peasants because if they disagreed, they'd be going to HE double hockey sticks. So the idea is that here is a religion where they can believe in God, have salvation promised to them by faith alone, and they didn't have to remain hostage to the state leaders. Now, it got to the point that a lot of times that some local prince who actually agreed with Luther would be attacked by a local prince that believed or agreed with Rome. And so we had several wars breaking out amongst all the German duchies as people were trying to say, we're winning the Germanic world for Protestantism, or we are winning the way for Catholic doctrine to be reinstated into this wayward province. So what was established amongst a lot of the German princes was called the Peace of Augsburg, where essentially the princes said, whatever you want to believe in your little fiefdom is fine. We are not going to try to kill each other in the name of religion. Now, one thing I do want you to notice if you want to try to look at a map in a previous slide is I want you to see that Luther's teachings were popular in northern Germany. Essentially, the further away you got from Rome, the more likely that people were able to say to themselves that the Romans weren't the way to go and that this was the way to go. Now, after the Protestant Reformation that was started by Luther, people started reading the Bible for themselves, and it wasn't that Luther had the only other idea of the way that Christianity ought to go. And so as people started reading the Bible for themselves, they started breaking away from Catholicism, but they also did not necessarily agree with Luther, and so they started their own little sects of religion to pass on their belief. The Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Anglicans are all examples of that in some way through history. The Brethrens, the Mennonites, all of these follow that tradition of reading the Bible for themselves and coming up with a different interpretation. Now, we have some other Reformation leaders. We have John Calvin, who advocated for predestination. The basic idea was that God had already picked who was going to be saved and who was not going to be saved, and that's just the way it was going to be. He was such a popular teacher that he was asked by Geneva, Switzerland, to become their state leader and enforce biblical law on everyone. Now, one of the things that we're going to see through history is that in making people live righteously just doesn't work. People have, since Adam and Eve, we are prone to sin. and using the state in order to make sure that there's no dancing, no drinking, everyone must go to church on Sunday, didn't work very well, because you just can't legislate proper behavior. You can only punish the behaviors that are damaging. That was the role of government. Now, if you're paying attention to a lot of what's going on, and you see around you where people say that they are of the Reformed Protestant traditions, usually means that somewhere in the bottom of their tree of where they broke off is that they came from Calvin. This is the end of discussion number 4, the Reformation, of Chapter 1, Renaissance and Reformation. Thank you.